Welcome to Breaking Down Bergman. I'm David Friend,
I'm Sonia Strimban.
and we are looking at Persona.
Ska jag sätta på radio? Det är någon pjäs, tror jag.
Förlåt mig. Förlåt mig, min älskade. Du måste ändå förlåta mig. Ingenting annat än din förlåtelse eftertraktar jag. Förlåt mig och jag kan...
Vad skrattar fru Fågelråd? Det är skådespelerskan som är så rolig.
Vad vet du om barmhärtighet? Vad vet du? Vad vet du om barmhärtighet?
Fru Fågel, jag förstår mig nog inte på sånt där. Jag är nog intresserad av film och teater, men det blir så sällan tyvärr. Jag har en kolossal beundran för konstnärer. Jag tror att konsten har en kolossal betydelse i livet. Särskilt för människor som har det svårt på det ena eller det andra sättet. Jag skulle nog inte tala med fru Fågler om sånt där. Det är nog att ge sig ut på hal is det. Ska se om jag får in någon musik. Är det bra så?
Watching Persona was filled with a huge amount of angst and anticipation.
I was really looking forward to seeing this film. I mean, we'd heard so much about it, and I'm happy to say that it was not a letdown.
No, it certainly wasn't. And if anything, it was far more complex than I had imagined. But I think for us, that was a good thing, if not a great thing, because we not only had a lot to debate about, but a lot to sort of piece together after we watched the movie for the first time and revisited it for a second time to gain, I guess, an extra level of understanding.
And also to convince ourselves that some of the things that we surmised from the first viewing were actually accurate, and make sure that after a second viewing we were still on the same page.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things about Persona is it has encouraged a huge amount of debate between film fanatics and the casual viewer. And we want to get into a lot of that. And so we're going to break this video into two parts. So where do we start, Sonia?
Well, why don't we start by talking about our general impressions of the movie and why we felt that it was a success. Because if you recall, another film that had quite a lot of build-up for us was The Seventh Seal. And when we did watch the film, it's not that we disliked it, but we felt like maybe it was just overhyped for us in a way. Like we had heard so much about it that by the time we got to watch it, it didn't quite materialize.
And like The Seventh Seal, this is the kind of film that has really weaved its way into pop culture. And we were familiar with at least the visual images of Persona.
Even when you watch something at the time, you might not recognize and say, aha, that's Bergman's Persona. But when you think back on it as watching the film, you can definitely see the parallels.
In terms of Bergman's career as a whole, I think this really marked an achievement for him. As a filmmaker, he's always been trying to merge those conflicts that we've seen and the themes that have, come throughout all of his movies. But I felt like in Persona, he really found a way to marry the art of filmmaking, as he's been trying to do, especially with the God and Man trilogy, with a lot of the themes and messages that he's been struggling with for, 2 decades now. And I think a lot of viewers who have seen the movie try and pin down exactly why they love Persona. And from what I've read, it seems like a lot of people have a huge amount of trouble paring it down and saying, this is why I enjoy this film. And for us, I don't want to speak for you, but I think after we watched the movie the second time, we realized this movie is great for many reasons, but one of them is that it's focused. It has all of the messages and themes and struggles that Bergman has been, trying to make into that fantastic film. And it's all just so cleanly laid out. And for us, because we have been doing this project, Persona seems to be that ultimate that we were reaching for, where we could look at Bergman's career up until this point and see numerous references to all of the films and all of the themes and everything that Bergman has been grappling with in his personal life and trying to put on the screen. And it was all just laid out there for us. And it was so beautiful in some ways that I don't think that we recognized it at first, because he was doing it so masterfully that it wasn't, on the screen, so obvious.
There's something about this movie that is really difficult to put your finger on it, but it just works.
God dag, fru Fågler. Jag heter syster Alma. Jag har blivit anställd för att ta hand om er under den närmsta tiden.
Now, with a lot of Bergman's best work, it seems to come out of some tumultuous situation in his life. This time, like many of them, he was laid up in a hospital and probably debating his potential demise.
Yeah, he always was concerned with his mortality at these times, and I think the sheer anxiety and the pressure of it really made him think about life and what it means and all of those other themes that he's introduced us to before.
But the entire development of this production just seemed like a little bit of luck everywhere he went. And even the casting of Liv Ullmann, who pretty much had been an experienced actress on the screen before now. I think Bergman pretty much cast her on the spot with knowing very little about how she would deliver on the screen. And her role wasn't one for a newcomer, you would think. Because it didn't have a lot of dialogue, it was an incredibly complex role. And the close-up that he used in the film called for subtlety and expression, but a certain form of professionalism that you just can't achieve from grabbing someone off the street, you would think.
I actually think that the lack of dialogue put more pressure on her to emote, and I think that for a young actress, it definitely was a very challenging and heroic acceptance of a role. And you have to wonder kind of how this made Bibi feel, because with this film, you can almost see the merging and the transition from one muse to another.
Yeah, and in fact, this marked the beginning of a very long relationship between Bergman and Liv Ullmann, both on screen and off. But she also had a friendship with Bibi Andersson off the screen before Persona began shooting. And I think that really benefited the production, because the relationship between these two women on the screen could be built by two professional actresses, but I think the layers of a relationship off the screen can be seen in the film.
Yeah, there definitely was a very palatable level of intimacy between the two women, and that merging that I think Bergman was trying to articulate in the film was so seamlessly done that it really sparked one of the biggest debates about this film that exists out there till this day.
Yeah, in fact, it's one that I think film students have written numerous essays about, and film scholars have probably given many speeches about, and that's whether or not the two main characters are in fact one woman. And I think that we have a pretty certain answer for ourselves, at least, and that would be yes. Yes, they are.
Yeah, we felt that basically, well, let's be honest, the first time we watched the movie, it does take you for quite a spin. We did struggle with it at first. When we saw the movie the first go-around, we were sure in one moment and unsure in the next of how the characterization was actually happening in the film. And I think Bergman intended it to be that way. He wanted to unsettle the viewers. He didn't want us to feel confident that we understood the story right off the bat. He intends you to think about this movie and to really dig deep and experience what the character is experiencing. But I'd be really curious to hear you articulate why you were convinced that there's only one character. And who do you think is the real person between the two women?
There's two characters. There's Elisabeth Vogler. She's the actress, and she has gone through a psychological breakdown. And then there's Alma, the nurse, who is to tend to her, basically. Bergman puts them on an island, and by doing so, he puts them away from all of the things that could complicate the story and really breaks it down to these two women and the way that they interact. And I think as they interact visually, he starts to show us that, in fact, they are the one. A lot of it comes through Liv Ullmann's character, who's always facing the camera, and Bibi Andersson, who usually gives it a side shot. And Bergman does this consistently through the film, which it's not telling us what is going on, but you start to see the shot repeatedly in different framing, and that theme has to mean something, right? And I think it took us to the second viewing before we really broke down the specifics and figured out that that was part of the coding. But it's not just the faces, it's what the women wear. It's a black and white film, so of course it doesn't have to be as obvious as it might have been in a color film, but they are wearing clothes that at least follow a similar scheme. Usually they're both in black, or they're both in white, or at least that sort of shade. And when you're seeing all of this coding repeatedly going through, I mean, it's not done by accident. Bergman is saying something with that in itself.
But pay attention to who is wearing black and when, because I think it's a really interesting visual message that Bergman has worked into the film, perhaps suggesting when these women's state of mind correspond with each other.
And then the third and the most obvious comes at the very end of the film, with the splicing of the two faces, which is probably one of the most symbolic shots of the movie. They literally are one. So I mean, if you haven't got it by that point, then a second viewing will give it to you once you see that. There's also Bergman's choice of using constant close-ups of the women, which confines the space. Aside from the island, let's just forget that for a moment. The fact that these women are so closely composed in all the shots is Bergman saying, in the filmmaker's sense, that these women are one. He's pushing them together with the framing of the movie. But there's a lot more to it than just the actresses.
For me, there were different clues. So I do recognize all the things that you're referencing, and it definitely guided my understanding visually of the two women. But for me, the metaphors were more symbolic. So for example, I really liked how the settings in the film were symbolic and metaphorical for the mental state. And an island is by itself one landmass that is fully contained. And so that to me implies that it's only one psyche that we're really talking about. And the two of them are in it. So like a split personality in one mind. And at first, it wasn't entirely clear to me which mind that was. I wasn't really sure if it was Elizabeth that was the main character, and then Alma was just a projection of another personality in her mind, or whether it's Alma and kind of she manifests this crazy patient to symbolize her own inner psychosis. But as the film progressed, it became a lot more evident that it is, in fact, Elizabeth, and that Alma is this outer projection of some kind of trauma that she's suffering on the inside.
But I think even before we get to the island, there are clues that we are in a mind of some sort. And it wasn't, again, until the second viewing that I picked up on this, but the film opens in a hospital room, and literally Alma walks in through a door that seems to come from nowhere into this space, which is almost totally undecorated. And I think that's one of the first hints.
Yes, she does emerge as if from this portal into existence. And it's also the way that she's introduced to us. It's very static and flat, and almost the way that you would write a name card for somebody, or you would write a character on a page. She says her name, she says her age, she says that she's married, and she gives these very flat little details about herself. And Elizabeth is really the one that's more complex, more human, that has emotion and fear and anxiety and panic. And even though she doesn't verbalize any of that to us, it's Alma that's her real mouthpiece in the film. Another clue for me that was very significant, and the more I thought about it, the more convinced I became that it's important, was when we are first introduced to Elizabeth's psychosis, and we have this kind of disembodied voice of the doctor telling Alma, the nurse, when she appears, what the problem with the patient is. And it says that her psychosis really happened when she was on stage, and all of a sudden, during a performance of Elektra, she fell silent for an entire minute and then never spoke again. Mm-hmm. So when I was thinking about it, the point around Elektra really stuck with me, and I wondered why Bergman would choose to include that detail. It's not arbitrary. So then I thought, well, what does that really mean? And sure, Elektra is a Greek tragedy, and that's probably the piece that she was performing on stage. But I think he's actually referring to the Elektra complex, which is a Freudian psychoanalytical term. And that, to me, is really the biggest and earliest clue that tells us that we are talking about psychology here and about psychological trauma and some kind of break. And the person that's referencing is Elizabeth.
Though I think Elektra is one of the more obvious examples that Bergman sort of puts out there for the audience, but there are others, and there's one that comes very early on. In fact, we had to do a freeze frame to catch it. It's when the boy is laying in the bed, and he opens up a book that is Russian, and we had to Google this one.
Yeah, it's called The Hero of Our Time by a classical Russian author, Lermontov. And it's a collection of stories with one main character. And what he really did in those stories was challenge the reader, much in the same way that Bergman challenges his viewers, about our perceptions and understanding of characters that we deem to be either good or evil, so the antagonist or the protagonist. And what Lermontov did was he presented us with this abhorrent character that typically you would have a very negative reaction to, and you could clearly say, he is evil, he is bad, he, holds everything that's negative in humanity, and therefore we should criticize him and hate him and whatever. But then in the very preface of the novel, he actually challenges us to go beyond those assumptions and to try to have a different perception of this horrible, horrible man. And in a way, Bergman always challenges us as viewers in his films to see things like weaknesses and negative human character traits as something to be sympathetic towards and empathetic towards, and maybe to pity and try to understand from a different perspective. So I think it's another clue to us to try to engage with the trauma that he's showing us in this film and to somehow sympathize with it, and therefore, like I always feel, access a greater truth about our own humanness.
But we want to leave it here because we have plenty more to talk about with Persona. In specific, how Ingmar Bergman worked a lot of his past films into this film as references and sort of made what we think is a much fuller masterwork. So join us next time on Breaking Down Bergman, where we discuss even more about Persona.